hacker. I'm one of the co-founders of Parse. We make back-end services for mobile developers, and we were acquired by Facebook a couple years ago. I'm here today to talk to you about how JavaScript is eating the world. So, everybody is pretty familiar with JavaScript. It's been around for a while. About 20 years ago is when it first took off. It was the era of all of a sudden, the web is a thing, everyone's using a browser. Everyone started using JavaScript without really knowing it. And for the first decade or so, it wasn't even something you would build a real application in. It was a way to make some words wiggle around on the screen. A lot of people, myself included, first dabbled with JavaScript in this era and really got a strong impression of it, that it wasn't ready for prime time. There's sort of a conventional wisdom that arose, saying, this language has some fundamental flaws. It's okay if you have no other choice. I mean, you can use it, but it's just fundamentally not that great. That's the conventional wisdom, and what I'm telling you today is that this conventional wisdom is wrong. In fact, JavaScript is eating the world. I have two parts to this prediction. First, eventually, the vast majority of all programming is going to be done in JavaScript. Second of all, you're going to like it. I know that might be hard to believe for some of the JavaScript haters out there, and I know you're there. But let's dig in. What does it mean to say JavaScript will be the most used programming language? Well, let's think of it as a few different battlefields. When you write code, where is it running? There's three primary battlefields here: browsers, servers, and mobile applications. So let's jump in and look at browsers. So for the last 20 years, JavaScript has been king in the browser, and JavaScript in the browser has never been stronger than right now. The only real contenders have been things like Flash and Java that ran in plugins, but really, these things have not been the primary way of delivering code in a browser for over a decade. The fundamental problem with both Flash and Java is that you just don't get a native experience. It doesn't feel as good. And especially with the rise of browsers that don't really support plugins, like mobile browsers, there's very little prospect anywhere on the horizon of any other sort of code running in the browser becoming dominant. One interesting recent try was Dart from Google, but one interesting side effect of having so many browsers is that there is so much effort needed to make a new programming language runnable in all of them that this essentially creates a huge moat. It's going to be very hard for anything to disrupt JavaScript in the browser. But I think the things I'm saying here are probably not very controversial. So let's jump into a more interesting battlefield, the battlefield of the server. This is a lot more complex. There's basically two sorts of programming languages that you run on servers. Scripting languages, generally easier to use and slower, and compiled languages, which typically better for large teams. They run faster. Programming languages that run on servers has been a fragmented market for ages. And in many ways, the fundamentals of this market have not been changing. All of these programming languages, the newest one here is C#, which is about 15 years old. This isn't an area that seems like it's changing a lot. There are new technologies that arise that people start using a lot. If you think of Ruby on Rails or Django for Python, things that are usually tied to a scripting language, get a lot of hype, are cool and new, but a couple things happen with these new technologies. One is that they're displaced by a newer fad. And the other thing is that when companies grow up, often there's a very compelling efficiency or large team reason to move to a compiled language. Think of Twitter ditching Ruby on Rails after it had scaling trouble. So, what's different recently? Well, I blurred over something when I said that all these programming languages are at least a decade old, because the thing that has really changed here is the rise of Node.js. Node.js is only around 5 years old and is taking off like crazy. Here's a chart of job openings on Indeed, but there's a lot of different ways you can get at this same data. Basically, if you really want a job, then Node.js is a great thing to hop into right now. There's not really any doubt that Node.js is becoming much more popular recently. So the question is this just another flash in the pan? Or is there something fundamentally different going on here? For a lot of application development frameworks, you were okay just ignoring them and figuring, hey, this will change. Once people grow up, they'll do something different. But something different is happening with Node.js. It's flipping the typical script. If you look at companies that are adopting Node.js, well, one example is PayPal. This is no fly-by-night startup, at least not nowadays. But PayPal has adopted Node.js. And they adopted Node.js when they already had a significant chunk of their application built in Java. So if you look at their rationale, it wasn't that they wanted to try a hot new thing. It wasn't that they were primarily interested in performance. It's that they were frustrated having there be two engineering teams to accomplish something, one speaking JavaScript and one speaking their server-side language. It just seemed inefficient when you could have one team building both of these things. Instead of two engineering teams, you have one engineering team. It's easier to recruit. You need less people. If you have one really savage expert, then they can guide the work of both teams. There are a lot of advantages here. So this is a totally different rationale than the typical reasons to adopt a new server-side framework. There's other companies in the same boat. Netflix is also adopting Node.js. This is not the sort of thing we saw happen with the rise of Ruby on Rails, for example. And the rationale here is really similar as it was for PayPal. You have a set of engineers that are already familiar with JavaScript, and you are starting a new area of work. You are now working on the server, and so what programming language are you going to use? You have a huge advantage to using something you already know. I've been going around at Web Summit the past couple days and telling people what my talk was about, and I've gotten a bunch of reactions. Some people say, oh, that's fantastic, I totally agree. Other people say, oh, I hate JavaScript, I hope you're wrong, I'm going to root against you. But almost without fail, every company has somebody working in JavaScript. Every company has someone that knows JavaScript. So just the sheer amount of engineers who know JavaScript creates this fundamental advantage for programming language adoption. So what this means is the forces driving JavaScript adoption on the server are very different, and so we can expect them to behave differently over time. In particular, the advantages of adopting server-side JavaScript are that the same work requires less engineering to get it done. So the pain that it saves you can almost be measured by people's salaries. Where if you think of the advantages of using an efficient compiled language, this is, hey, maybe you need 50 servers instead of 100. The benefits there can be measured in price. So is this something that's going to go away over time? Well, what's happening over time to engineering salaries? This is going up and up, as you can tell if you've been hiring or recruiting over the past 5 years. And what's the expense of cloud services? Well, look at the history of Amazon Web Services pricing, or really of any other competitive thing. Here the price is going down over time. So the fundamental forces that are pushing towards Node.js adoption here are only going to grow stronger over time. In general, what's happening here, you'll notice that nothing I've said so far is really about the quality of the experience of writing JavaScript code. it's not winning because of that. It's winning because of the ecosystem. And one of the most important aspects of the ecosystem is the people. People who know JavaScript, people who want to use JavaScript. When there are more people who want to use JavaScript, it's a more compelling argument to build new products in it. And in this case, this part of the ecosystem really wins out, even if JavaScript is fundamentally missing a lot of what you would want in a language. That's a big if, though, because it's not just that the ecosystem is more important than the product when it comes to JavaScript adoption. It's also that, in many ways, the ecosystem causes the product to get better. I think the best example here is the rise of Node.js in the first place. Node.js is built on top of Google's V8 engine for running JavaScript. If that hadn't been available, then it would have been an immense amount of work to create the libraries that form the core of Node.js. Basically, different ways to expose the underlying operating system to a JavaScript environment that typically would only have access to the DOM or whatever is provided by the browser. So, because Google wanted to compete in the browser market, built Chrome, put so many resources into Chrome, made it open source in order to further their Chrome-based goals, as a side effect of that ecosystem, the V8 engine was created, and that made it possible to build Node.js. So that's one example of how the ecosystem is helping the product get better. But I think there's a couple others that are even more compelling. And these are the things that, if you picked up JavaScript once, 10 years ago, learned a little bit, decided that you hated it, and you wanted to spend your life avoiding JavaScript, well, it's about time for you to look again. So one critical thing for adoption is speed. So this shows the Octane benchmarks, which is a fairly common, well-rounded JavaScript benchmarking system. And over the last few years, you can see that Firefox and Chrome performance, in particular, have massively improved. This is about a doubling of Firefox performance. And the other browsers, pressed to keep up, have really been performing similarly. What happens here is more than any other scripting language, possibly more than any other programming language, there are huge incentives for large corporations to put a lot of resources into improving JavaScript performance. If Google didn't put in this effort, then Chrome would fall behind Firefox and the other browsers in terms of performance, and that would be a problem. So that's an incentive to invest a lot of effort here. This is effort that has not gone into other programming languages. If you look at the performance of Python, Ruby, Perl, PHP is a slight exception with a lot of the work going on at Facebook, but I think that's a slightly different story. Basically, these other programming languages are not seeing this type of performance increase. This happens via work in compilers. It's complicated, just-in-time compiling things. A lot of programming language advances are happening in the JavaScript ecosystem, and they are just not trickling out to the other scripting languages, and maybe they never will. So in fact, nowadays, JavaScript is often competitive with compiled languages in speed. One thing that PayPal and Netflix ran into is that comparing Node.js performance with Java performance, they were often finding that JavaScript gave them better performance, especially in a model where they want to do a lot of asynchronous operations, for which Node.js is a great fit, and the Java libraries often are not. But performance isn't the only thing, and to me, it's not the most exciting thing. The most exciting thing about JavaScript improving is the experience of programming in JavaScript. So here's some JavaScript code. I don't know about you, but when I see this, I feel a wrenching feeling in my gut. This is not doing anything too complicated. You have a list of pairs, and you're iterating over the list and calling a function on them. That's it. But there's so much boilerplate here compared to most scripting languages. I mean, if you're doing this all day, your fingers are going to fall off typing bracket 0 bracket. That's not fun. That's what leads a lot of people to pick up JavaScript and say, really? This is the best way to do something simple like iterate over a list? Like, what am I doing here? I might as well be writing C++. So there's something really different happening nowadays. JavaScript has been stuck for a couple decades, not really making much fundamental progress to the language, in part because some browser vendors were actively trying to make the browser weaker and continue having their operating system dominate the world. That is much less of a problem nowadays. There are actually standards committees that can work out how JavaScript, the language, can move forward. If you're not familiar with the process known as either ECMAScript 6, ES6, ES 2015, any of these things, in the next couple years, JavaScript is going to make more fundamental changes in the programming language than it has in its entire lifetime. This code is going to look like this. Much simpler. I mean, if you measure the complexity of code by how many pixels on this slide are not white, right? I mean, look at this. Hey, it's cutting our complexity in half. Oh, that's pretty great. I mean, this is comparable to Python, to any of the well-designed languages. And the thing is, it's actually very complicated to make fundamental changes to a programming language. In many cases, you end up stuck in a tough situation where you can't advance the language. One example here is the migration from Python 2 to 3. This has been going on for the last 5 or more years, and the fundamental issue here is even when you say, hey, here's a new version, if there are many systems out there that only support the old one, you end up in a situation where, hey, what's the incentive to upgrade? And nowadays, maybe half of Python code is in Python 2, half of it is in Python 3. It's a really tough problem. It's tough for library developers. And JavaScript is only getting around this via a massive amount of tool development. If you're familiar with Babel or Webpack or any of these minifiers, there are essentially many different people building JavaScript to JavaScript compilers so that if you check out, for example, Babel and Webpack, although there are many other ways to do it, you can write code like this today, write it in ES6, take advantage of these new great language features, and if you were already using a minifier, well, you just drop in an ES6 to ES5 compiler, and you can be using this stuff. So one of the fundamental reasons that it's possible to change the programming language at its core is that people are willing to put so much effort into developing the tooling. And the tooling is really another key part of the ecosystem here. So this whole thing about the power of the JavaScript ecosystem is something that we think about a lot at Parse. So one product that we offer is Cloud Code. This is a product aimed at mobile developers. It's like basically, if you want a little bit of activity on a server, we make it really easy for you to write a few lines of JavaScript, hook it up to your mobile app, have it call a bit of this function, and come back. So this has been a really popular product, and what we see all the time is a bunch of people who primarily know Objective-C, but, well, you still know a little bit of JavaScript. So this is pretty good to deal with. So when we first launched Cloud Code, Node.js was much younger than it is today. And there wasn't the huge amount of modules that there now is in the Node ecosystem. So one thing that we actually launched a couple weeks ago is a partnership with Heroku. Now, instead of directly using the Cloud Code product, you can run Node.js on a Heroku dyno and use all the power you would get from a full Node.js deployment and continue to use the same mobile development tools that we were already providing with Parse. So, talking with our customers, this has been a great boon because so many people want to use different functionality that is already built as a Node module, and now you can access it without Parse having to rebuild all of this stuff. So, speaking of mobile development, the third battlefield, mobile apps. Honestly, this is where my case is the weakest. Mobile app development right now is dominated by building for iOS and Android. The dominant way to do it is to build native applications using Objective-C or Swift in Java. JavaScript right now is not a big part of developing on these platforms. Why is this the case? Well, it's not for lack of trying. there have been framework after framework that offer people the ability to build mobile apps in different languages. I think a lot of people saw the first generation of these tools. I think PhoneGap is a good example here. Many of these are basically, hey, you can build a mobile application, but what you're actually doing is building a web page and wrapping it in a small frame that makes it deliverable as a mobile app. You can put it on the App Store. The biggest problem with these first generation of tools is that the user interface you can use is really restricted. You can only use something that is explicitly provided in the framework, and often when you use this stuff, it just feels like it's not a normal mobile app. You can tell when you use it that it's not a great experience. So I think this is another case where a lot of people came to the first generation of JavaScript tools and said, this doesn't feel that great. The newer generation of tools, like NativeScript, Xamarin, React Native, take a different approach. You fundamentally have access to the same sorts of UI controls that you do when you're developing directly in Objective-C or Java. But you can do the vast majority of your development in a different programming language. NativeScript and React Native are JavaScript. Xamarin's aimed at the .NET ecosystem, but the principle is really similar. You probably already use apps built using these technologies, and you don't think these apps suck. You probably can't tell the difference. That's the fundamental goal here. So basically, I think this new set of technologies has a very good chance to displace the status quo where you must use Objective-C and Java because the user interface is identical. It avoids the problem that cursed Java applets and Flash when it came to web adoption. And personally, my money's on React Native. If you're not familiar with it, you should check it out. So the final question is, well, hey, is mobile the ultimate platform, or will there ever be anything new and cool? Of course, there'll be something new. I can't predict what exactly it is, but I think that there's a very good chance that the next platform will be fundamentally based on JavaScript. When iOS and Android were being built around a decade ago or so, Node.js was nowhere near as strong as it is now. The story around JavaScript was very different, so I don't think that the same principles were in effect at the time. A couple examples of JavaScript going places where you wouldn't expect it are Mongodb and Tesla. So MongoDB is a new popular database, and one interesting thing about it is that the fundamental language of the database is JavaScript. You can run JavaScript code in your database. If you want your actual database process to run a little bit of JavaScript code in every object, I'm not saying you should do that, but if you do, JavaScript is the native language there. And the fundamental reason they chose it is because of the ecosystem, because there's so many JavaScript developers. And Tesla is another interesting case in the Internet of Things, and there are other similar examples. But Tesla builds a microcontroller that basically has a Node environment on it. And it's basically a way to appeal to a bunch of developers, let them use JavaScript, and let them also develop Internet of Things concepts. I think the fact that it's so common to target JavaScript for a scripting language of new platforms is a sign that it's likely that whatever the next big thing is, it'll run in JavaScript. So, in conclusion, what is going to happen is that the ecosystem of JavaScript programmers and JavaScript tools is causing JavaScript adoption. And not only that, but the ecosystem is causing the product itself to get better. And that dynamic, these two things together, that mechanism is what is making JavaScript is eating the world.
Ow, 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 ow.
Thank you.